Okay, so Steve McRae hosted a hangout yesterday with Sarah Michelle and Lizzie Lang on the subject of trans women in sport, and I watched the hangout. It's a very good hangout, and I'd recommend people give it a watch. It's a good sort of hour and a half or however long it was. Worth watching, I think. I noticed on Twitter Steve had asked me to say what I think about it, so what I think about it is that I thought it was quite good. But as always with these things, there's always a couple of moments where you sort of pause the video and think, yeah, I wish I could have my little bit of input on that. And I just wanted to go through one of those, which is this whole business of measuring sport, which was touched upon. And there was some interesting points Sarah Michelle had said about maybe using AI to try and do it. And I think that might be potentially beneficial in solving some of, I suppose, what you could say the soft problems. But I think, like the problem of consciousness, there's a kind of hard problem as well, an intractable potential problem that's not quite so easily dealt with. And so I think you can almost divide it into three sections in terms of the kind of measurements that we're talking about. And Steve pinpointed the fact of scaling, and scaling being an issue. So I think that we've got three things. We've got the measurement of particular metrics, but then we've got two different sections of scaling and different ways that you can deal with that. And one way in which you can deal with it, which is what Joanna Harper tried to do, but there may be other situations where it's maybe not even possible. That's where it becomes an intractable problem, not of measuring the different physiological metrics, but how they scale. And it might be that there isn't even really a sensible answer with that. It's the kind of, you can tell the best and you can tell the worst and you can see that, but it becomes a kind of almost like some kind of quantum mush in the middle, where you can't really put a value because you are comparing apples and oranges. So what you'll note that nearly all the discussions take place involving sporting events that are quite easy to measure, right? Any running race, jumping event, anything like that. These are events that are very easy to measure and you have a definitive value on somebody's performance. But a whole bank of sports just are not of that kind, right? Any of the sort of codes of football are not of that kind. They're not amenable to that kind of measurement. So whereas you can compare the best 100 metres runners today with 100 years back and see the progression throughout that period, we know that association footballs are better now than they were 100 years ago, but we can't put a figure on that because it's not amenable to that, because the game isn't measured in that kind of way. It's a team effort and it's a performance against another team, and actually the physiological metrics that are involved in football aren't necessarily expressed in the outcome of the result goals in any event. So that's a bit of an issue. So the first thing is that obviously you've got to decide what are the physiological metrics which are important, which was something that you highlighted in the hangout. And that's interesting. A lot has been talked about hemoglobin counts, of course. The thing that is generally talked about with regard to distance running and all endurance events, VO2 max, that's the amount of oxygen your body can utilize in metabolizing the energy. And so it's the maximal amount, which effectively gives you a measure of your maximal aerobic potential, the amount of aerobic work that you can perform. And that seems to scale up pretty well with aerobic ability. So that's a pretty good measure of, for example, how well a distance runner will perform or a cyclist will perform over longer distances. But we know that that's not the only factor that's involved, and so then we can start looking at other factors. One of the factors, the kalenjin dominate distance running. One of the claimed factors might be a very, very small calf size, because just the same as Oscar Pistorius's blades, having a low mass and therefore a sort of low angular momentum as you're running along further down your leg might be quite a key factor when you're talking about just a sort of 1% at the end there of the spectrum. So that might account for the way in which they dominate, particularly men's distance running. I don't know, it might be, it might not be, but then you've got the question of how does that scale in terms of things like VO2 max. And it's a difficult one to quantify with these things, because if you look at that, some of the stuff that Ross Tucker talks about in his podcasts and stuff, he's right when he pinpoints that effectively often VO2 max is the thing that gets you through the door, just as having a high testosterone level is what gets you through the door for male events rather than female events. But it doesn't necessarily mean that at the elite level, what determines the difference between first and eighth is who's got the highest level of testosterone. Then other factors come into play. It's akin to the old nature-nurture thing, really, where, well, what's the balance between nature-nurture? Well, it depends how similar your upbringings are. If your upbringings are almost all identical, then nature plays a huge part, whereas if you're from widely diverse upbringings, then that nature component's the same, but compared to a larger nurture component, comparatively it's smaller. So it's kind of complex as to how those things interrelate and not so easy to put a number on. But nevertheless, you can potentially do so. And one of the things they did with Oscar Pistorius was to attempt to put a number of seconds on each thing. Each different factor. So there's the momentum and the angular momentum of the leg. There's the air drag. There's the amount of energy you get back from the springiness of those carbon fibre blades. There is the loss that you get on the start, the greater difficulty in running around the corner. The big impact, in fact, was the fact that he can't put as much force through one of those blades as you can through a human leg. So you can put a number of seconds on all those things as plus seconds and minus seconds and average them all together. So that's in the one camp. Then in the middle camp, still sticking with these events that are potentially, I'm saying, measurable, amenable to measurement, you can adopt the approach that Joanna Harper said. And that gets away from this scaling issue of how important, maybe you found 8 physiological factors, how important are they all? The approach that she takes effectively is just to make that a black box. And rather than looking at what's inside that black box, just look at the outputs. So you're looking at the inputs, in this case testosterone level, and you're looking at the outputs. And allowing, so it doesn't really matter what the factors are, just see what happens out the other end. So she did a grading procedure. So what you do is you take the athletes when they're competing, effectively hormonally male, in that male category, and you grade them. And you can grade them 2 ways. You can either grade them as the percentile in relation to the athletic population. So like if you was a cyclist on Strava, you could say that you're sort of, you're typically 100th out of 1,000 or whatever. And then you could grade yourself afterwards, after you've had cross-sex hormone therapy. Am I still at the sort of 90% mark in my performance? So you're relating it to other athletes. Now, she didn't do that way. Probably didn't do it that way because often in sport, the women's category is not as well developed. Again, that's something you would see in cycling, the professional peloton in cycling. The women's peloton kind of drops off a cliff, right? The top women, a similar level for female athletes as the top male athletes, but because it's not as well developed as a sport, by the time you get sort of half, 2/3 of the way down the peloton, the performance level is miles away from the top cyclists. Whereas on the male peloton, it's a lot closer because it's a much more developed sport. It's drawing from a bigger pool of athletes who have devoted themselves to cycling. So there might be an effect there, although distance running is a lot more developed as a women's sport as cycling is. But what she did was she graded it instead relative to the fastest ever time run. So if you were running as a male athlete, let's say 110% of the time that the fastest ever time ran in that distance was as a male, then she looked at you after you had transitioned at competing in the female category and said, are you still running at that 110% mark? And if you are, then your graded performance is the same. And I think that's an excellent way of doing it because it gets you away from that what's going on within the black box issue. So that's all fine and dandy. But of course, a lot of sports are not amenable to that. And that's when I say it gets into this territory of a kind of hard problem where I'm not even sure it's possible to scale these things. Like, say, if you took at something like association football, there's not only a myriad of factors, but they're not measurable within the game because the outputs of the game don't necessarily scale to those factors. You're playing as a team game, you're playing against different teams. And some things which may be an important factor, nevertheless might kind of max out anyway, by which I mean something like, for example, endurance capacity. Your aerobic capacity as a professional footballer is important. You need to be able to maintain your level of performance throughout the 90 minutes. If it goes into extra time, 120 minutes, and that can be key. But at the same time, it's probably not that key for professionals competing against one another, because they are all sufficiently fit that they can maintain their level of performance throughout most of the game. So it ends up not being key. So if you see what I mean, it's critically important. If you don't make that minimum level of aerobic fitness, then it's going to be a major thing. But once you've hit it, then suddenly it becomes much less important than some of the other physiological factors that would key in. So how you would begin to scale them in a game like that, where you don't have access as a sport, it's not amenable to punching out those numbers in the first place. And in terms of how these things scale to one another, it really is an issue of judgment. And even when you find a factor that's important, it could sort of top out, and then cease to be important if everybody's hitting that kind of level. So I just don't know how you even begin to do it, even taking the kind of graded approach. There isn't a graded approach equivalent, I don't think, for things like that. So I think really what you could do, what I propose you would have to do, using the present zeitgeist of male and female sport, let's assume we're not moving away from that into some newer model like I've suggested, some other people have suggested. If you're sticking with that, what maybe you could do is to try and look at those basic metrics that you have, right? So the basic metrics are going to be height for some sports, not for association football so much, but for some sports like basketball, volleyball, rowing, etc. And then things like power, strength, strength endurance, lactate threshold, endurance, things like that. These are sort of basic physiological metrics, and evaluate each one and see whether transitioning on a certain level of cross-sex hormone therapy makes the difference for each one. And then for any particular discipline, what you would then do is you'd make a sort of more general analysis. You're not necessarily going to get the chance to scale them, but what you would say is, right, what do we perceive to be the 5 most important of those physiological metrics in this particular discipline? And in terms of those most important metrics, are we satisfying them? Are we ticking the boxes? And if we're not ticking the boxes, is there some kind of not a confounding factor, but a mitigating factor that at least makes up for it? So in basketball, obviously, for example, height doesn't change, and height is incredibly important in basketball. But maybe if, for example, it was found that muscle mass was of such a loss that you were actually underpowered for your physical height, which you could measure, right? You could do that as a kind of standing jump test. So, for example, somebody could be 3 inches taller. An average male is about 4 to 5 inches taller. So you could take these two groups of people, which would be the athletes the athletes that are transitioning before and after, and you give them a jump test before and after, because that's quite critical in basketball, obviously. And if they're still jumping the same height, it could be, if they're jumping the same height after transition, I said that wrong. If they're jumping the same height after transition as a female athlete who is 4 or 5 inches shorter, so she's got to jump 4 or 5 inches more, but if the muscle loss was sufficient, then you might be that you can't actually clear the ground very much, and so it equals it out. So there may be ways that you could function in tests for specific sports like that. But with regard to the scaling, like I say, so I think there's three categories with it. The first category are the basic physiological metrics where you can easily work them out and scale them, which ones are important. Then you've got the ones where it's measurable. It's a sport with a measurable output, but you're better dealing with it as a black box, as Joanna Harper did. And that will obviously be a usable model for other things such as weightlifting or anything like that. But then you have these other sports which lay outside of that. They're a part of that. Those methods are never going to work for that because you don't get those kind of outputs. I think I said on one video, it would be immediately apparent to you if you saw me play football alongside Lionel Messi that he's a considerably better footballer. But if you were to try and put numbers on that as to what factors particularly it was and how they scale relative to one another, that you would be on a losing mission. You'd be on a hiding to nothing trying to do that. But maybe what you could do is divide it down into what a panel of experts would regard as the 4 or 5 or 6 most important physiological factors, and then see how they fare. Are they physiological factors where the reduction in testosterone does make the difference, or ones where it doesn't? That was perhaps the bit that I wanted to add as I was listening to that, because that's one of the most fascinating and complicated parts of the whole discussion, I think. But it's a good hangout. If you're watching this and you're not Steve McRae, which everybody other than Steve McRae will be, not Steve McRae, if you haven't seen that, give it a watch, because it was really good. Okay, that's it. I'm going to stop and go and play with my lad.